Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 185, The Shakespeare Ladies Club, a conversation with Christine and Jonathan Hainsworth. For today's guest episode, it's a warm welcome to the podcast for Christine and Jonathan Hainsworth, co-authors of the recently published book, The Shakespeare Ladies Club. Their book explores the lives of four ladies who were crucial in ensuring the original work of Shakespeare wasn't forgotten in the 18th century and beyond. In 1736, these three ladies of quality, two from the aristocracy and one a writer who ran a stationery shop, formed the Shakespeare Ladies Club. All three were so enraptured by the plays of William Shakespeare that they met to read and discuss them and his genius. Not content with this, they used their power and influence to campaign for a statue of their literary idol to be placed in Westminster Abbey. They were successful in that endeavour, but their role in these achievements has never been properly recognised. Along with other scholars, Christine and Jonathan's book is part of the process of putting that right. It is a very entertaining and informative read that I thoroughly enjoyed, as I hope you will our conversation with just a taster of some of the details Christine and Jonathan have revealed. Christine and Jonathan Hainsworth live in Adelaide, South Australia, and have a passion for historical investigation and challenging the conventional wisdom regarding famous historical subjects. Christine spent several decades working for the Australian government in social services. Her work in a program to reconnect lone parents with training, education and employment opportunities gave her a unique insight into family and societal changes. Jonathan was educated in Britain and Australia and has over 30 years of experience as a high school teacher of modern and ancient history and English literature. He's a graduate of the University of Adelaide and the University of South Australia. I spoke to Christine and Jonathan from their home in Adelaide, South Australia. So before we talk a bit about the ladies of the title of your book, I'm hoping that you can summarise for us what the public's impression of Shakespeare would have been in 1736, both academically and in performance. I guess the subtitle of your book, The Forgotten Women Who Rescued the Bawdy Bard, probably gives us a good idea.
Well, the thing about Shakespeare is that by 1736, he was certainly something that was played and staged at the theatre, the two theatres in London. But he, as we know the plays, that was pretty much gone, because after he died in 1616, much of his repertoire of plays were already considered very dated for two reasons. One is he wrote for a very specific theatre, which is a theatre that had no roof. Going to the theatre was something you did in the afternoon at the Globe. And once it burnt down and the whole thing moved to Blackfriars in London, the theatre world became a world that was more respectable and also a lot more expensive, because it became something you did in the evening. So it had to be lit by candles, and they cost the earth. And so the audience that he had written for was a much more eclectic group of a mix of working people, people not working, people not sober, people from the aristocracy. But it was very much, he pitched his plays so that the audience of ordinary people could see themselves on the stage in the characters that he created. Now, by the time of the middle of the century, after he's died, theatre is much more upmarket and respectable. And it's also that the audiences now expected things that Shakespeare didn't have to do, which essentially comes down to scenery. He didn't have to do scenery. Now there has to be, if you say you're in Denmark, let's see Denmark. And it was also expected there'd be special effects. Then, of course, you have this interregnum of the Republican period after the Civil War, where everything is shut. According to the Puritans, pubs are shut, theatres are shut, Christmas is cancelled. And so when you get the Restoration with a capital R, with the return of Charles II, theatres are reopened. And this is a chance for Shakespeare to be seen again, not just those who can afford to buy the folio collection of his plays. And the thing about that is that, well, tastes had changed, and I think also the trauma of the Civil War and the Republican period, people wanted more light entertainment, and they also wanted, or an innovation that the king brought from France was that now women would play women's part. And that was a big commercial success, but men were not expected to act in plays. They were expected to declaim. By declaim, it meant you stood there in a very static pose and you did a poetry reading, in effect, because it was thought that while the actresses, well, of course, they can become other women, men can't, who wish to retain their reputation as some sort of gentleman, because what are you doing? You're deceiving people. You're pretending to be someone else. So the Restoration is terrific, but it's also a very uneven period where, men don't really act, and the Shakespeare plays are considered way too crude. Macbeth doesn't repent of his terrible sins. So they changed Macbeth. They thought they were doing the author a favour because his time is long gone. And so they added the witches were on wires and there was singing and dancing and it became like a vaudeville entertainment. And King Lear, again, people thought, it's too crude to put on for this audience. I mean, the king often attends theatre. So, Lear, a king who's insane, and it's also depressing. So they changed it. He went from being mad to merely being a bit grumpy. And Cordelia doesn't die. We're not having that. Let's give her a romance with Edgar. And at the end, everyone's alive, everyone's happy, he's still king. Much better. Now, that's how Shakespeare is by 1736. When he's performed, it's these updated or cleaned up versions or censored versions where a lot of his very racy dialogue, that has to go. So it was gone. What about something like Hamlet? Was that played? Well, it wasn't changed, a play like Hamlet. What they did was, it's about 4 hours long, so they'd only show about 25 minutes. It was like the B movie before the main attraction, which was usually harlequin acts of people kicking each other in the rump. So all you got from Hamlet was just a few bits and pieces, a couple of duels and sometimes the ending. But that's a bit depressing. So he's been balderdized long before that's actually happened. So in 1736, for the ladies to say, right, this is an extremely dangerous moment in our culture where our greatest writers' original plays are being cut loose from theatregoers. Like only people who have the folio can kind of read. They read the folio, they read their copies to each other, but they want to see it on the stage. And one of their friends was Alexander Pope, great poet, but he was like the other so-called respectable intelligentsia in that he said, well, I'm an editor and I've re-edited Shakespeare's plays for publication, and they were completely and utterly cleaned up. Like, don't have gravediggers in Hamlet having dialogue. That's not what the Greeks would have done. So another editor called Theobald, he was so incensed by this that he brought out his own translation, editing of the plays, in which he said this is against Mr. Pope's, because it's got to have all of the things that some people find offensive, because that's real life, and the Enlightenment is about nature and embracing the realities of the world, not superstition anymore. So Theobald, it's interesting, outsold Pope like 8-1, and Theobald is the version that, as the Canadian academic discovered only a few years ago, Theobald's version is the one that the ladies had. So that's where Shakespeare's on the ropes by that stage. if people go to see Shakespeare at all, and often they don't, but if they do, it's singing, dancing, happy endings, much better.
Yes, difficult for us to imagine in the post-Victorian world and the study of Shakespeare. But your ladies, let's go back to your ladies from your book. You would say they originated their interest in Shakespeare from reading primarily, and saw that there was something more in the original plays than they were seeing on stage at that time. There were 4 ladies that you cover in the book, and I think each of them needs a special mention. So can you paint us a quick picture of the 4 ladies? Perhaps we'll start with Susanna Ashley Cooper.
Well, Susanna was only 26 when she found the Shakespeare Ladies Club, and she was Susanna Noel and a daughter of the Earl of Gainsborough. She married at 14 to Anthony IV, Earl of Shaftesbury, and from sources we've found it was something they desired to do, and it was a very happy marriage of equals. The fascinating thing about Susanna is that where she grew up in Exton Park at Rutland, there was a performance in 1596 of Titus Andronicus at that home. And we believe that, and that was by the Chamberlain's men, and we believe that she grew up in a culture at home of reading, of loving Shakespeare. She was an artist and she was a garden designer. She loved music. Her and her husband, Anthony, were patrons of lots of writers, including Handel. They were a patron of the composer Handel and a close friend of him. So they lived a very rich cultural life in Wimborne St Giles in Dorset, where their home still is, and family, the current Earl of Shaftesbury, still lives there at St Giles House. One little quote that I'll give you about her and her husband: a smiling scene of unity, their life, the wife, the husband, and the husband, wife. And if you think about that, this is in the 1730s that somebody is looking at this couple and saying they are equal in a world where women have virtually no rights. So she was a very special woman, a very smart woman. I'll go on to Mary Montagu, who also joined the club. And Mary was known as a society beauty, and she had a lot of influential friends. So the 26-year-old Susanna, 4th Countess of Shaftesbury, would have been quite happy when Mary said that she'll come along and join the club and join their campaign. Mary was in her 40s. She was 47 when she joined the Shakespeare Ladies Club. And even though she was a woman of privilege, because her parents were John Churchill and Sarah Churchill, Duke and Duchess of Marlborough, her life was always in turmoil. She didn't get on with her father-in-law, Ralph Montagu. He was a bit of a scoundrel. She did not get on with her mother, who was Sarah Churchill, the one-time favourite of Queen Anne. Sarah did not like Mary for some reason, and people felt it was because Mary was her father's favourite. So Sarah was a very competitive mother. She married John Montagu, the second Duke, who became the second Duke of Montagu, when she was about 15. And everything we know about him, he was a big-hearted man, but he had a very juvenile aspect to his character. And he was known as one of the all-time great practical jokers. And I think he's certainly someone you'd want to have as your friend, but you may not want to be married to him. So she had a lot of stress in her day-to-day life, and she also had one of her daughters who gave her a lot of grief over 2 fiancés, one who tried to kill himself, one who did kill himself, and then a third marriage which was not very good either. So when you look at Mary's life, you think to yourself, if Susanna Ashley Cooper came along and said, join my Shakespeare Ladies Club, you will do it.
It is very entertaining to read about all of those antics that he gets up to, but yeah, you wouldn't want to live with him for sure.
No, that's right. So the third member, she's a little bit different because she's not aristocratic, but she is very well educated. And Elizabeth Boyd, we don't know a lot about her, but what we do know is what she told us about herself in her pamphlets that she printed. She was one of the earliest professional women writers, and she was a very talented writer. We suppose that because she knew particularly Mary Montagu, and she was also, Susanna was a patron of Elizabeth Boyd as well, perhaps her father had been in the royal court, or she tells us he was in the royal employ at some point, but the family seemed to have lost their money and the father died. So she was faced with having to support her aged and infirm mother and her siblings. So we saw her very much like Shakespeare, because he was a man who had to pay the bills. So he would write plays to pay the bills, save up for a home, support his family. And this is really what she had to do.
As far as we know, she never married.
She was also suffering from ill health for most of her life. But she wrote something in particular that shows us she was a part of the Shakespeare Ladies Club, and it was a play called Don Sancho. And in effect, it celebrates the goals of the Shakespeare Ladies Club. And she wanted to have that performed, and she was promised that it would be performed. Yes. And she had it read at a theatre, but in the end, it was never staged. And she had a fear that it would be plagiarised, and she died at 35, and once she had died, it was lifted by a couple of people, and one of them was actually David Garrick.
Yes. Well, we'll come on to Mr. Garrick again, I think.
But the thing about Elizabeth Boyd is she is declassed, to use the French term, and in that very rigid society, Susanna and Mary Montagu, by the customs of the aristocracy, cannot receive her as an equal. Mm-hmm. And yet they did. This is what's so wonderful about this club. From what we know, they sat around either in the London home or at Wimborne St Giles in the grotto, in front of their own statue, or Susanna's statue of Shakespeare, the first such shrine ever. And they just were equal with each other, enjoying the plays and reading them aloud, and no doubt reading some of the bawdier dialogue and laughing, and then saying, how can we get this back into British culture where it belongs? So that, we just think that's a lovely egalitarian aspect of this club.
Yes, and I think it really comes out in the book that you paint a lovely picture of the whole of that society, because they are four very different ladies drawn together by Shakespeare, yes, in effect. And so we get a real picture of what their life might have been like. And we do have to cover one more lady before we talk a bit more about actually what the club was doing.
So the youngest member was Mary Cooper, and she was a poet, and she came from a family of poets, of female writers, which is interesting.
Yeah, and unusual.
She really was a bit of a firebrand feminist. When you read her work, she must have been influenced by these women in her life, and they must have given her confidence to write the things she was writing, because when you read some of her work, just like Elizabeth Boyd, you could very well be reading things written in 1969.
Yeah, really.
A lot of the things that they're talking about
in the West,
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Not necessarily other parts of the world where women aren't allowed to drive or aren't allowed to own property.
Women's liberation movement. They were calling for equality in marriage, women being able to choose who they married or if they married. Safety in the home was a big issue, domestic violence, safety on the street. It's fascinating to read these works, and particularly Mary wrote a poem which gives us, in a club that didn't keep notes, and we'll talk about why they probably didn't do that a little bit later, but she wrote a poem about the Shakespeare Ladies Club. So that gives us a lot of information about what their goals were, what they achieved, and how proud they were about it. The other thing about Mary is that we found some new sources about her from the Norfolk Archive, and we actually found the response to her poem on the Shakespeare Ladies Club written by the man who would become her husband. He wasn't at the time. His name was William de Grey. And his poem is, what would you say, Jonathan, an early feminist
It's a proto-feminist.
Written by a man.
Because he's saying they must be allowed to own property.
Wow.
And he's saying, don't just stop at promoting Shakespeare, promote the women writers.
Yeah. Keep going.
You mentioned there that they didn't keep notes of their meetings, which is such a shame, isn't it? Because the conversations held in private in what we would today call a safe space, I guess, must have been fascinating.
Yes.
The women and their husbands were part of the Whig party, political party, but they were the Patriot Whigs, so they were a breakaway group, which in effect were opposition to their own party in Parliament, and they despised Robert Walpole, who was the Prime Minister.
They saw him as very much corrupt, and that the administration was lazy in terms of social reforms, and that in terms of trade, they all believed in sort of free trade. They wouldn't be happy with any talk of tariffs today. They felt that Walpole just bent over backwards to please Spain, even though Spanish were attacking not British warships, but British trading ships. And they thought, how did we get to this stage where we're supposed to be moving towards more, democratic features in our society? And yet, if you have a play that even might be criticising Walpole, it will be taken off the stage. It'll be censored. And this was the Licensing Act, which was another impetus for them to bring back original Shakespeare plays that had been written, not all of them, of course. Shakespeare's as much a figure of King James, but he is a figure of the Elizabethan era, and they romanticise that as that's when Britain was really getting going to what we should be now, and we must bring back that level of passionate patriotism. And in culture, that's very important too. We go to the theatre. First of all, it's extremely dangerous to go anywhere because there's no police force. And there had been one in Roman Londinium with the ex-centurions, but there wouldn't be such an equivalent until the early 19th century. So to go anywhere is dangerous, but to go to the theatre where lots of people have been drinking, lots of upper class men love to just be completely irresponsible and destructive in their behaviour. So we try to make the point in the book that they've got a lot of things that they have to overcome, and one of them is just sheer violence in the theatre, let alone outside the theatre. But their view was that's because it's not worth watching. If you just have people doing very childish and infantile acts, if you have men and women portrayed on the stage in a completely juvenile and degrading way, how can we become a better people? So we must have the robust manliness and womanliness of Shakespeare's characters back up there. Get rid of the singing and dancing, and people will sit there and be transfixed all over again.
So I suppose the next question is, how did they manage to do that, or did they indeed manage to do that?
Well, they did, because as we say in the book, they had so much against them, but there was one thing that must have kept them going, and that was William Shakespeare really is the greatest writer since Homer because his characters are so rich and his stories they're entertaining. His plots are entertaining. So they got some originals back on the stage, but this is not a revival led by, say, Hamlet. And King Lear, they couldn't get changed. The Fool was removed from Lear and didn't come back until the middle of the 19th century.
Yeah.
So what they did was they got back plays that hadn't been used from the folio even after the Restoration. And this is plays with very strong female characters in them, even though in Shakespeare's time, of course, it's actually a young man playing a woman, pretending to be a man, pretending to be a woman. I mean, it's multi-layered, all that, but
Yes.
they said, let's get and put on As You Like It. Let's get Measure for Measure back on. Let's get Love's Labour's Lost back on, because these are fun and entertaining and just brilliant at showing real people and how they are full of all the virtues and vices of human beings. And that's the Enlightenment ideal. We must be science over superstition, sort of thing. So first of all, they got the plays back on the stage, and the audiences did respond to them. And we know that because in the 1738 to 1740 seasons, Shakespeare shoots up to be a quarter of all the plays produced. About half of those are the originals. So the other thing was that they sat on the stage. This strikes us as, that's a bit egocentric. But in those days, this is how rough everything is.
Yes.
People could come in halfway because it was cheaper. People would stroll across the stage because it's a quicker exit to what they called a toilet. So they would advertise these plays as at the request of a lady of quality. And we know that, therefore, that's a Shakespeare Ladies Club choice. And they would sit on the stage and they would stare down, if they didn't, in fact, probably say, right, come on, enough, be quiet, let us hear the actors and actresses. And that was effective. So they're very much known to be public figures who are doing this. And we know this because Christine discovered a marvellous source where there was a riot one night. And, the production was over and prematurely. And this newspaper has sort of apologised to the Shakespeare ladies. And, it's done in a very condescending way. I want to be, this is a man writing this, but he says, I want to be the secretary of the club and help you to avoid such disturbances again. But it does show that, they had to put up with kind of quite threatening situations, but they kept going. And in the end, by 1741, they've achieved their other objective, which is we must have a statue of Shakespeare in Poets' Corner. Now, this had been tried before by men. Theatre companies had tried to raise funds because there should be a statue to him there. And they failed. They couldn't. There was indifference. There was a view of, it's not even his plays anymore, is it? He's got some sort of pokey little memorial in Stratford, wherever that is, so that'll do. Whereas they were like, no, he is the greatest writer we've ever produced, perhaps anyone's ever produced. Got to get him this statue. So they got these performances which raised money. They probably put in their own money to an extent, the aristocratic ladies. And they achieved very quickly, when you think about how long it took. They only took a few years and bang, it's there in 1741, and that's the one in Poets' Corner to this day.
So was that fundraising as much as actually getting the permission to have it raised in the Abbey?
Yes, they put on 2 benefit performances to raise money, but also raise public awareness that this was going to happen. And their idea was that people would go along to Poets' Corner as if Shakespeare was buried there. They could see his statue, they could honour him as if that was his final resting place. The problem the women had was that the social limitations of the day for women is that they didn't conduct business, particularly not with men. So they had to form a committee who would talk to the Westminster Abbey authorities and arrange to have that statue put in. And the women, they weren't looking for fame for themselves, so it probably wasn't something they thought very much about. And at the time, people knew that the Shakespeare Ladies Club had raised the money and
chosen the sculptor and what it would look like. But as the generations passed, all that was left in the official record was that male front, the committee of men who'd done it, and that inadvertently contributed to their legacy or their memory being removed, airbrushed out of history.
I suppose that is something that they must have been used to working in that way because it was their time and they may not have liked it. I'm sure they didn't, but that was the way things worked, and they were able to manipulate that system to get what they wanted.
Yes.
But it's good now that you're resurrecting their memory for us and everybody else in the book and in other work that you've been doing. Just to touch on it, because I do like to ask people this question about how it felt getting into that research that you were doing, especially as you've uncovered new things that hadn't been connected with them before, to actually get to those documents and see them, touch them, feel them. That must be something pretty special.
Even photocopies.
It really is, and particularly when you think that nobody has probably read them for a couple of 100 years, particularly the documents in the Norfolk Record Office of Mary Cooper and her circle. The people at Norfolk Records weren't quite sure what was in them. It was just named as a bundle of documents. So we had them all copied. Who knows what's going to come along, but it was incredible because she had obviously gathered a few documents to keep safely, and there were admiring letters from a boyfriend when she was a young woman, and then there were poems from the man that would become her husband. Yes. And there's poetry that she wrote, for example, when her father died. And then there's the letter that William de Grey wrote to her in response to the Shakespeare Ladies Club poem. So that was a very amazing...
That was a coup.
Yeah, that was an amazing thing to read.
Yeah.
She also had a letter in there which was very curious because we had found a document or pamphlet written. It was released in 1739 called Woman Not Inferior to Man by Sophia.
Which is assumed to be a pseudo-anonymous name.
No one could ever work out who it was. And
right.
It was really a call for women's equality. Then there was another one released called Man's Superior Excellence Over Woman, written by a gentleman. And that was mind-blowing. That was so awful.
Even by the sexist standards of the time. It is, as this gentleman says, well, women, they're useless as mothers.
Mm.
They raise children to believe the wrong things. It's much better for a man to be a mother, father. They can only produce milk. That's all. It's as crude as that.
So then a third pamphlet came out, Woman's Superior Excellence Over Man by Sophia again. And so she looks at everything the gentleman's written and just goes to town on him. So coming back to the letters we found from Mary Cooper, Norfolk Record Office, she has one there that says, to a gentleman. And she goes to town on this gentleman talking about...
it's almost line for line.
It's
like
very similar to Sophia. So we don't know that the Shakespeare Ladies Club were Sophia, but
right.
we feel confident that they are viable candidates for having written those.
Well, it's hard to think there could be anyone else, really, because these were the first public feminist writings in British history. And they're used to doing things for the first time. And the fact that the four of them could get together to write it.
They could speak French. They were highly intelligent. They were brilliant writers. Two of them were already writing feminist works. And people at the time weren't quite sure who Sophia could have been. And some people said, oh, it's a hoax. Well, clearly wasn't a hoax. These women had something to say. They mentioned a couple of names. One was Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who was a poet, and she was quite an outspoken feminist for her time. There was a reason they thought it wasn't her because of something that was said. And there was another woman called Lady Sophia Firma, and they said, oh, because her name's Sophia. Well, but it's interesting because when you look at both of those women that were named, they are also part of the circle of the Shakespeare Ladies Club. So we suspect that people were getting quite close to the source of those pamphlets, and
but we argue that we've got the best candidates.
Perhaps an academic will look into that more thoroughly and test that theory, and we hope that they do.
I think that if I could just elaborate on something, I think that one of the things that we discovered, which is there to be discovered. I mean, we didn't discover the Shakespeare Ladies Club. It's been some brilliant academics in the last few decades who have found them and mentioned them in books, and people like Fiona Ritchie and Michael Dobson and Genevieve Kirk et al. We were trying to write a book for the average reader, for people to have access to it, to publicise it. But anyway, the thing about Shakespeare is that I just always thought, and I used to be a history teacher, that you could sum it up as David Garrick saved Shakespeare. David Garrick, the first male actor in 1741 to do what the actresses had been doing, realistic acting. And we try and recreate that moment in the book when he stepped out on stage as Richard III. And initially it caused great consternation in the crowd, like, what's going on? It's one of those things that it could flop, but it doesn't. And very quickly it becomes the new standard of male acting. It must be like, but the thing is, we didn't realise until we did the research that Restoration actresses had always been doing it.
Yes, that was a really interesting point that you pulled out in the book that I also hadn't really appreciated.
And so it just needed a male actor, and we think the Shakespeare Ladies Club are very much the mentors of Garrick. Someone's got to break with this convention that it's unmanly and deceitful to be a proper actor on stage. And Garrick, well, he was kind of like a total unknown. So if it doesn't work, well, he'll have to go and find something else to do with his life. But it does work. And he had seen an Irish actor do it with The Merchant of Venice. And that gave him the courage to do it on a London stage with great success. And then, of course, he becomes an absolute superstar, but he hogs the limelight. He is an appalling person to work for. He's parsimonious about paying for anything. But even he, at his Jubilee, which is a very strange affair when you think that nothing's quoted from Shakespeare. But anyway, at his Jubilee in 1769, he does thank, though not by name, but he thanks the ladies who formed their club and rescued the wonderful plays of Mr. Shakespeare. Even then, we thought, of course, that's a way of not having to thank actresses, because he should be thanking them as well, but he doesn't like admitting that there's anything he didn't think of first. So Garrick is who gets all the credit now. And that's part of the story, but it's by no means the whole story, because without the Shakespeare Ladies Club getting Shakespeare's originals revived, then there wouldn't have been audiences thinking, you know what? This is really good, this play, but there's something jarring about the men. The declamation style, it jars with the way the women are playing their characters. So, in a sense, the Shakespeare ladies had set it up for Garrick, so that whoever steps forward and does it like the ladies, they're not going to be booed off stage. They're going to be welcomed as, well, good, because now it's not uneven on stage anymore.
Mm.
And there have been some recent developments with the statue in Westminster Abbey.
Yes, we were able to join with Professor Michael Dobson of the Shakespeare Institute and Genevieve Kirk, who was
American academic.
An academic who had written on the Shakespeare Ladies Club. And we got together a document of evidence and sent it to Westminster Abbey.
The management, and to say that, you know, it's the committee of men that are being credited, who had nothing to do with it, except as a front. And they were completely open to changing it because, I mean, how could they know when their records don't show the Shakespeare Ladies Club any reference to them at all?
Yeah.
So someone's got to point it out, and it turned out to be us and these other academics. And they were like, we're delighted to change it and have these women acknowledged as they should be for what they did. They didn't just put the statue in, they rescued Shakespeare's reputation, his plays, and that meant that they set in motion more realistic theatre, male acting, Garrick, so that by the end of the century, you know, Shakespeare's like Holy Writ. And by the next century, he's the greatest in the world. And we don't disagree with that. It's just that somebody had to rescue, I mean, it's the wonderful newspaper report where they have Shakespeare's ghost write to the paper and say, thank you, ladies. Thank you. Because I was ruined. My plays were ruined, and you've restored me, and I bless you. You're so good looking, and we'll stop there, you know. But you know, that's fair enough. They should be, there should be statues to them.
They've changed their historical records, yes, and they acknowledge the Shakespeare Ladies Club now
On their website
as the spearheads of that their campaign and the statue that we see to this day. And most of us, when we think of Shakespeare, we think of that image of the statue. And we were lucky enough to go there a few weeks ago and just sit down and watch people come in to Poets' Corner, and every single person from any place in the world where they had come to visit that area, they looked at Shakespeare and they knew who he was, whereas a lot of the other statues they didn't know, but they all knew Shakespeare. And we thought, that's for ladies. They were right to do what they did.
Yes. And yes, the statue is posed like an 18th century Enlightenment intellectual, whereas our first primary source reference to Shakespeare in our book is a restraining order by a sheriff of Shakespeare and a man and two women saying, leave this man alone because he's frightened you're going to kill him. So he was a man of, you know, a complicated character, obviously, and a working person. But I'll tell you this, though, the pose of the statue is so similar to the pose of James Cragg's, an earlier statue. And that, of course, is one of the lovers of Mary Churchill, who becomes Mary Montagu, who's sick of her practical joker husband with his itching powder and his magicians in small bottles, etc. She has an affair with this very dishy fellow. And, well, his statue is also in Westminster Abbey, right around the corner. And the pose is almost identical. We wonder if that's an in-joke.
My thanks to Christine and Jonathan for taking the time to talk to us. The Shakespeare Ladies Club is published by Amberley Publishing and is available from wherever you get your books. I've put some links to the online stores in the show notes and to Christine and Jonathan's website, where you can see details of their other books and reports from their recent visit to the UK to launch the Shakespeare Ladies Club. Next time, it's a welcome return to Tim Fitzheim to discuss the life of the man who took over from Will Kemp when he left the Queen's Men. Will's boots were big ones to fill, but as we will hear, Robert Armin did a pretty good job. In the meantime, if you've not done so already, please join the Facebook page or group, or find the podcast on Instagram or Blue Sky just to keep up to date with new episodes and other theatre-related things. If you do feel able to help out with the costs of running the podcast, then please head on over to Patreon, where you will find additional content for a small monthly fee or selected episodes for a one-off donation. You can also make a one-off show of support through Ko-fi.com. I look forward to your company next time, but if you have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or through the website, where you can leave me a voice message by clicking on the microphone icon, or you can write to me on the contact page. That's all at www.thehistoryofeuropeantheatre.com.